Emily, thanks for joining us. And
Sure.
Nobody is familiar with you.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Emily Hanford. I work at American Public Media. I'm a reporter. I'm not a teacher. I'm not a researcher. I'm not an expert in this field when it comes to teaching people how to teach reading. I'm a reporter who got interested in this topic about 5 years ago and have been reporting on it ever since. And I have a podcast that came out a couple of months ago called Sold a Story, which you can find at soldastory.org. And there's a bunch of other reporting that I've done over the years that's linked to on that website. And I think that my definition of reading is reading is getting meaning from printed text. Or from text, I guess, maybe printed is a problematic word. Being able to get meaning from text, understanding what you're reading. I think that you can read things and not understand them, but part of being a reader is having the skills and ability to try to make sense of what you're reading. So to be able to get at the words and what's behind the words. So I think that's the basic. I think reading is basically being able to read the written, is being able to get meaning from written English if you're an English speaker.
Okay, great. Thank you, Emily. And let's go to Natalie. We'll go left to right across the image that was out there on social media and on the blog piece. So Natalie.
Well, thanks, Drew, for organizing this. I'm Natalie Wexler. I'm like Emily. I'm not a teacher. I'm not a researcher. I'm a writer. I write about education, mostly about literacy. So I wrote a book called The Knowledge Gap. I co-authored another book called The Writing Revolution. And I write, I have a Substack newsletter called Minding the Gap, and I contribute to Forbes.com. And, you know, I think that it's a tricky question, defining reading. I think that we have been, I basically agree with everything Emily said, but I also think we've been using reading to cover two very different things. One is deciphering words, decoding, if you will, or word recognition. And the other is comprehension. And I think this has led to a lot of confusion about how to go about teaching kids to read, which we can talk about more later. But basically, if I ruled the world, I would redefine reading. And this is not my idea. I'm borrowing this from a professor named Alan Camhy, who proposed that we define reading to mean just decoding. And that would clear up a lot of the confusion about what goes into comprehension. Because just briefly, decoding, phonemic awareness, phonics, those are like skills. Those are skills that can be taught directly and applied generally. Whereas comprehension, the rest of literacy, writing, so there are foundational skills involved with writing as well. But when you're getting past those foundational skills, it's not like you can teach those things as a set of skills and teach them directly and apply them generally. It's right, reading comprehension is really everything you know. And same with writing, in addition to the mechanics that are involved. So that's my long-winded answer to how to define reading. And I'll stop there.
And I neglected to mention that Natalie has been on the podcast twice prior to this. We talked about the knowledge gap. And then also I think about constructivism. This was, I think, the first time maybe even before COVID, which seems a billion years ago. But you can search the podcast archives for that. So I believe we had Micki, if I'm going left to right on the image. So Micki is here in Kentucky, not far from me. So Micki, introduce yourself, please.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Micki Ray, and I am currently the Chief Academic Officer in the Office of Teaching and Learning at the Kentucky Department of Education. My background, I was a high school English teacher for 15 years before going to the agency to work on the Kentucky Academic Standards for Reading and Writing. And so have gone through some transition and am now working to implement as a state level leader our new literacy policy that was passed in January or in the 2022 session. And for me, when people ask me about defining reading, I always fall back on just the simple view of reading. And so much that has already been said, but that word recognition plus language comprehension equals reading comprehension. And I think that is an accessible definition, both for educators and parents and families of early readers as well.
Okay, great. And then
Can I just say one thing that's an important part of that definition is that it is word recognition times language comprehension, which is different than plus, just to get technical about it. So that so it's that the simple view of reading is language comprehension times word recognition equals reading comprehension.
Got me on the mathematical formula.
It's okay. It's just that it matters when you're thinking about what it means.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Last but not least, let's go with Kate.
Hi, everyone. I have been teaching since 2000, which coincidentally is the year of the National Reading Panel report with the PBNC-CDSB here in Ontario. I've taught a range of different grades and subjects, and it wasn't until I moved to kindergarten 6 years ago that I started to see that our approach to reading wasn't really working. So I kind of did a deep dive starting then into the science and the research. I have definitely been impacted by both Emily's and Natalie's work. I'd love maybe later to get a chance to talk about how I saw my classroom experiences reflected in their work as well. I now do, presentations. I do PD, things like that for other boards and organizations. And I also feel fortunate that here in Ontario, we recently had the Ontario Human Rights Commission conducted a right to read inquiry. And back in February, they released 157 recommendations for teacher prep programs, for school boards, all sorts of different areas for improvement, basically. So we're already starting to see some of that movement here in Ontario, which is very exciting. And I'm thrilled to be part of this panel tonight. So thank you. And in terms of my definition of reading, I actually had the same thing in mind that Micki mentioned with that whole simple view that's not really so simple. But I think the end goal, we want kids to be able to recognize the words, decode, read the text independently, but also to have that understanding of the text that they're reading. That's what we want at the end. And so both of those factors involved in that mathematical equation are things that we need to be, explicitly teaching and working on, from K right up. I think there's kind of a myth that it's just the little kids that need structured literacy. Structured literacy just looks different depending on the grade and the age level. So that's how I would define it.
Great. Thanks. So when I started to dive into this myself, and I was a teacher, for those who aren't aware, I was a teacher for 15 years, but at the middle and high school levels and social studies. So really wasn't teaching reading and hadn't really thought much about it. My mom was a teacher. My grandmother was a teacher. And I asked my mom, how did I learn how to read? And because I didn't remember, and I don't know that many people remember in those formative years. And I have two daughters who are just about to be 14 and 15. And I thought, I don't even know, I was embarrassed. I didn't even know how they learned to read particularly. So trying to investigate some of that, my mom told me that she said, I'm sure there was some phonics there because I would get to a word that had PH and I would say, paha. And so it sounds like there was some phonics there, but I'm 53 and years have gone past. So I've asked just to kind of give us some grounding here, Emily and Natalie, to give us a sort of an overview of like the last 100 or so years, because we obviously have seen some shifts over the last, 30, 40 years. But what did that look like in the last 100 years or something like that historically, the teaching of reading? So Emily, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, it's obviously very complex. We could talk about this for a long time, but to be a very high level, I think that there's been sort of shifting back and forth, and people think of it as a pendulum swing between two different ways to teach reading. One, and I think a good way to think about it is sort of bottom up or top down. And so I'm actually talking right now about the sort of word recognition side of things. And I think Natalie made an important point. And when we talk about the simple view of reading, I think that definition, word recognition times language comprehension equals reading comprehension, is an accurate definition of what reading is, but I think Natalie makes a very good point about what it's a little bit different about what it takes to teach it, right? And that's part of that equation is actually more teachable and is a skill that can and should, as we know from a lot of research, be explicitly taught. And another part of it is not as achievable through explicit instruction. It is much more complex, and kids bring a lot to the table already on the language comprehension side of things. And it's those two parts of the equation are very different from each other. But when it comes to so I think this idea that we could potentially define reading as just decoding. So right now I'm going to talk about the history of helping kids understand the very first thing that they need to do when they get to school is figure out how to read the words on the page that they know how to say. So let's just like talk about that. That's like a major sort of goal of kindergarten and first grade. So there are two basic approaches. One was you start with the whole word, and the other was you start with the pieces of the word. So you either go like top down or bottom up. Or some ways people thought of it as like sort of the meaning first or the sounds and the letters first. And that is sort of like phonics versus whole word, I would say. And those are sort of the two different ways. And, so one way emphasized more memorizing whole words, big chunks of words, putting those together. And the other was more about like teach kids the individual letters and the sounds they make and how to blend them. And then I would say this sort of new twist on that idea came around in the 1960s and 70s, which was whole language, which kind of merged into balanced literacy. And we can talk about the definitions of those terms later. And that was sort of seen as like a mixture of the two. And I think one of the things that we're understanding in the way that we teach reading is that that many schools haven't paid sort of enough attention to the decoding part of it, and the fact that there is a significant amount of research that shows that kids really do need, and kids do better overall when they're taught in a bottom up rather than a top down kind of way when it comes to decoding. Okay, good. Natalie, anything you want to add to that?
Well, no, I think that's a great summary on the decoding side. I would just say there's been a lot less attention to reading comprehension instruction, but there is a history behind that too, which very briefly, I would say, the idea of having kids read passages and then answer comprehension questions about them goes back a long ways. And so there would be these questions that were sort of designed to foster these comprehension skills. And then in the 1970s, research started being done by psychologists on reading comprehension strategies. Those were more what is called metacognitive. So it's not just practicing finding the main idea. The idea was more monitoring your comprehension as you read. And they looked at expert readers to see what do they do, maybe subconsciously, but they ask themselves questions as they go along. Am I understanding this? Can I relate this to things I already know? And so that got very popular. And that seemed to get this sort of imprimatur of science from the National Reading Panel. And I would say that is one aspect of reading comprehension, but it kind of got blown out of proportion. And so that it has come to be defined as reading comprehension. But I would say in terms of building the kind of knowledge that kids really need to understand complex text, I'm not sure we've ever done a really great job of that, but that's the thing that's really gotten overlooked in the last 20 to 30 years.
Okay, great. Well, Kate has made a shift and she's in the classroom teaching now. So I'm curious, and from all of you, to the extent that you want to chime in, I think it's important to give some sort of working definitions of science of reading, structured and balanced literacy, reading recovery, and then any other terms, which doesn't mean that these are the tried and true definitions, but the ones, as we kind of think about them, so you can hear what when we're using those languages or that language, what that means in the context of this conversation. So I'm curious, Kate, as you have shifted more from, if I'm correct here, balanced to more of a structured, how do you define, when you think of science of reading, and what does that mean to you? And then the difference between balanced and structured?
Well, I think the definition of the science of reading would basically be the research. I know Louise Moats has a great definition, but basically it's like the decades of research in different languages and all sorts of different things that have been done to advance the field of reading in terms of knowing how to best instruct kids and how they're going to best learn. So basically it's a research. For me, that's what I consider the science. And I think it's important to know who to trust when you're getting information like that. And so that's kind of what I have done. In terms of classroom practice, my differences between balanced and structured literacy I would say balance really starts with that whole idea of, reading being a natural thing, just like speaking, which science has told us it's not. But the idea that if reading is natural and we can surround kids with books, and just like when we surrounded them with oral language, they started to speak, the same thing will happen and they'll be able to start to read. And while certainly there are, children who pick up on the code a lot more easily than others, we now know that we do have to actually explicitly teach it. So that foundational skills piece of the explicit phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, and phonics definitely is a big difference in terms of, other things. I mean, balanced literacy, like how Emily had mentioned earlier, the whole word idea, a lot of memorization of whole words, sight words, drill, that sort of thing, which is different in terms of, the way we look at words and structured literacy. Also the text that we're going to use, balanced literacy, very big on the leveled text at the earliest levels. The kids are absolutely required to guess and use those cueing strategies because they are not able to decode the words. They have not been taught that code yet. So those are the kind of texts that the kids are expected to read early on in balanced literacy. Structured literacy, we look more for decodable text. And of course, any text is decodable once the child has been taught the code. But in the early kindergarten year, early in year in kindergarten, we're talking about, consonants and short vowels and that sort of thing. And so those are the texts that they would be starting with. And then the idea of balanced literacy, where, as long as they're getting the main idea of a text, it really doesn't matter. The classic example is pony versus horse, right? If it says one in the text, but they say the other, that's okay. They pretty much get it, but it's absolutely not okay because they didn't read the word correctly. They didn't even have the starting sound right. So that's just another sort of example of, the differences between the two.
Okay. And I didn't ask anybody to talk about reading recovery. My guess is most of the folks here know what reading recovery is, but, feel free, anybody to sort of jump in there and add any sort of meat to the bone on that or any of the other pieces there. I'll just open it up to anybody who wants to add anything to that.
Can I say one thing about the science of reading? I think it's important. I think what Kate said is important to reiterate. And I see a misunderstanding a lot of the time about that term, the science of reading. So it's not an approach. It's not a curriculum. It's not really a thing exactly. It is just a term for a body of knowledge, which essentially has emerged over the past 50 plus years, really. I mean, for a long time, various people from a bunch of different fields, psychology, neuroscience, education, linguistics, have been trying to figure out this big mystery, like, how do we read? How does our brain do it? And they figured out a whole lot of stuff. And they've done studies in all kinds of languages, not just the English language. And so the science of reading just refers to a body of knowledge. But I see it misused or misunderstood as like a thing you teach. It's not really a thing you teach. It's not a curriculum. It's not an approach.
Yeah, you don't say, I do the science of reading. You don't do it.
Right. You do something that is based on what has emerged from the science of reading. Is there's an understanding of what reading is, how we do it, why some people struggle to do it, the skills and knowledge you need to be a good proficient reader. And so there are ways to teach reading at different stages of the reading development process to best facilitate that end goal, which is reading comprehension.
And Drew, I don't know if this will be helpful. All of the registrants may know about this resource, but we found that the Reading League's defining guide for the science of reading has been especially helpful. It does offer that definition, but then it talks about as well what it is not. And so that's just an available free resource that can be utilized to kind of clear up some of the misconceptions, I think, around the science of reading. Yes, and that's it.
It's online and you can download it, but you can also get this little booklet, and it's really quite useful. It's very short and it's a good definition. So I recommend it if you all can see it.
Great. Well, one of the things that has been interesting as I've dived into this, and there are several problems here. One, that certainly is more granular about teaching kids to read, but then how do we shift and make the decisions and help people make those shifts? And there's some issues that make that harder, right? And I'm curious because, I know Emily and I'm sure Natalie have got some heat from people. You feel like you're criticizing, or they say you're criticizing teachers, or or worse. And Micki, having her role in the Kentucky Department of Education, trying to figure this out and help teachers be the best that they can be. One of the things that is a part of this is, how do we message and how do we help teachers understand this without making them feel like they're doing something wrong, right? Which is somewhat related to the sort of tribalism and camps that we have with binary thinking, but it's not the only thing, right? So, Micki, how have you sort of tried to negotiate and navigate that landscape from a I guess not really policy perspective, but something like that?
Sure. Well, for us, and again, I'm not sure that there's one right way to do any of this, but we have enacted the Read to Succeed Act by utilizing teacher academies. And so our academies are opt-in, so they're not mandatory. And some people have been critical of that, but I feel once you mandate something from the state level, there is a certain feeling that people would have going into that professional learning. And so for us, we've tried to focus on what the opportunity can provide to educators across our state in terms of the letters training. And letters is not the one singular answer, but we do feel like it is an essential first step that can help teachers and administrators in our K-5 Kentucky system to gain more information. And so one thing that we've said is that if you are skeptical, you are welcome. Come and join us in the learning and participate in the discourse. I think that when people are unwilling to have a conversation, that's when the learning stops. And so I welcome all of the discourse that's created through Emily's work and Natalie's work. We're utilizing that to engage in conversation with others, to encourage them to have their own personal learning journey that will hopefully lead them to partner with us as we move forward in this work.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I'm sure all of you get, and it is a question that was raised, I think, in a few places here, is, and Kate, you mentioned, following the science, right? It's the science, it's the evidence, right? But that I spent a lot of time in the space of inquiry versus sort of direct and explicit instruction, of which I think that's a false binary. And I'm constantly sort of trying to break down and seek the middle ground and the complexity and nuance here, right? But how do you respond when people say, there's one that, like Murray Clay had research, and there's research behind reading recovery. There's perhaps less study of the long-term, effectiveness of some of the things that are going on with science of reading movements now, whereas balanced literacy has been subject, and reading recovery has been subject to, sort of a really rigorous sort of look at it. How do you respond to that and think about that? And I don't know. I mean, Emily, I know you have had to have gotten a lot of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that I have been trying to do in my reporting is to sort of show and reveal that many of the ways that reading is being taught is based on an idea about how people learn to read, which this vast body of evidence that I referred to before has shown to be not quite right. So I am talking about something very specific here, like how is it that kids learn to read words and become good, make that very essential transition from being born as a baby who has a brain that is ready to speak their native language, to a child who can read the language that she knows how to speak. And so what the science of reading has revealed is that some of the sort of assumptions that have undergirded reading instruction for a long time turn out to be Not quite the case. Kate brought up one of them, which is that learning to read is not like learning to speak. And in fact, if you sort of look inside what's going on in the way schools teach reading, what you will find is that there are a lot of pieces of that belief that are contained within the approaches, the way that reading gets taught. That the answer when a mother comes and says, my son isn't reading, is just read to him more. Find him a book that he likes. Volume. And that is, not usually the solution for a 6 or 7-year-old child who is really struggling with decoding. The answer is typically not just make sure he has more text. That is probably not going to solve the problem. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I guess in general, what I've been trying to do in my reporting is sort of reveal and show that there are big foundational ideas that undergird the way that reading is taught in a lot of schools. And there's actually a lot of research that shows that some of those ideas are quite problematic. And that in fact, what the shocking thing is that reading sort of happens like very differently than what a lot of the prevailing ideas are assuming about reading and how it works.
Yeah, go ahead, Kate.
Wanted to jump in terms of, you mentioned like the binary thinking. And I think really what we all want is to use the most effective practices, right? So there are just some cases where research has fine-tuned some things being a little better than others. I'm thinking now, in the reading that I do, I often hear, oh, don't spend too much time on independent reading. And then some people interpret that as independent reading's bad, it's harmful. No, but we could use our instructional time better. And especially if kids aren't fluent enough yet for us to know that they're getting something out of the text during independent reading, we want to be careful, right? But then you have practices that are harmful. And I mean, if anybody has listened to Emily's podcast, we know about this, but in terms of even the cueing strategies, we've got functional MRIs, which are, pretty hardcore data, showing us the wrong areas of the brain lighting up when kids are using the strategies of poor readers. We are trying to rewire their brain to be strong readers, and we don't want to be doing something that's going to circumvent that. So it's not like that, these things are perfectly good and these things are perfectly bad. Some things are less effective, more effective than others. But then there are, some practices we really just need to get rid of.
Natalie, I know you wanted to jump in, but let me just add a little bit to that, because when we talk about the 3 cueing and the sort of ways in which balanced literacy works or doesn't work, one of the claims that has been made several places is that it's actually harmful, right? So it's like you've learned to do that differently, and then the long term, it might work in the short term, but long term it doesn't work, right? And with your work and your emphasis on knowledge and the importance there, I'm wondering if those two things interact in different ways. Like if somebody has learned to read using that sort of non-phonics, that balanced literacy approach, is knowledge, how does it interplay with that? And then, of course, I know you wanted to say some other things as well.
Well, I'll go to that question first. As I mentioned, we've got to understand that this term reading is being used to describe these two very different things. And we also need to understand that it is hugely important, especially for kids who are not picking up a lot of academic knowledge and vocabulary outside school, to systematically build that knowledge in school, beginning as early as possible. Because the longer we wait, the harder it is to fill in gaps in their knowledge that have emerged, both gaps between them and the kids who are picking up the academic knowledge and vocabulary, either in school or outside of school, and gaps between what they actually know in terms of academic knowledge, sophisticated knowledge, vocabulary, and what the curriculum assumes they know. Like when they get to high school and they're handed a textbook on world history, if they know nothing about history, if they know nothing about geography, not because they can't learn those things, but because they haven't been taught those things, they're going to be at a serious disadvantage, and it's going to be very hard to make up for those gaps. And so, but the way to build knowledge initially, starting in kindergarten, is not through children's own reading. It is through reading aloud from complex text, an expert reader like a teacher reading aloud to them text that they could not yet read themselves. And that can go on for, through age 12 or 13, really. That can be very beneficial for kids. Listening comprehension exceeds their own reading comprehension on average through about age 12 or 13. And through so not just listening, but also talking about the content, using that vocabulary. And what will ultimately happen is when their decoding skills, when they become fluent readers in terms of decoding, then all of that knowledge that they will have stored in long-term memory is going to kick in and enable them to read at a higher level. So that's the interaction between these two things. And obviously, though, if you haven't been taught phonics systematically, if you haven't been taught to sound out words, doesn't matter how much academic background knowledge you have or vocabulary, you're not going to be able to read. So you do need both of those things. But I would like to just go back to, I think, the question you were posing before, Drew, which is sort of opposition, resistance among educators to this very, I think, difficult to hear message that, what you've been doing may not be the thing that really works. And that's true on the decoding side, and it's true on the comprehension side. And I think one thing that's important is that this is no individual's fault, I think. I think this is a systemic problem. So teachers I think inevitably they often do feel guilty, but that's not the point here, is to make anybody feel guilty. And I think it's also, what I've found, I was warned, teachers, they don't like somebody who doesn't have classroom experience coming in and telling them they're doing something wrong. And I'm very sensitive to that. I understand it completely. And what has amazed me, and maybe Emily too, is how many teachers, despite the painfulness of this message, have embraced it and have become passionate about doing things differently. And to me, that speaks to how much they care about the success of their students. And I would say what Emily has really contributed here is to reveal to a lot of teachers who thought they were teaching phonics that in fact they actually weren't. And I think the same thing needs to happen on the comprehension side, because it's the same situation. Teachers think they are equipping kids to understand text through the teaching comprehension skills and strategy, and having them practice those skills and strategies on leveled readers, on random topics. And that's not really what's going to work. And so that message needs to be brought to them as well. It's a more complicated one. It's not as familiar, but it is just as important if we want kids to ultimately be truly literate.
Yeah. One of the things that really strikes me about this, and talking about binary, some of the things that are sort of circling around here, is how do we engage teachers and as a teaching profession be open and have a culture of critique and revision of approaches, right? So we're constantly looking at our work and seeing, is it effective? Is it as effective as it could be? When I talked with John Hattie on the podcast, one of the things in his last book, he was talking about, not just doing what works, but what works well or what works best. And so constantly being a part of that. Something that really seems to be a sort of piece of noise in that conversation and in how people negotiate that is this sort of idea. We've seen it in obvious other venues, but it's rearing its head here for sure, is sort of this tribalism and the sense of gurus, right? I mean, Marie Clay and Lucy Calkins, and I would imagine, Emily, you have some of that as well. Like people, like they're so vested in this sort of camp that they have a hard time even having that conversation. So, like, how do we negotiate that and think about how we remain open to the process? I mean, essentially, science is that process of dispassionately looking at what we're doing and doing it well, and then being able to sort of step back. So I don't know how we do that. If I had the answer to that, we wouldn't need this podcast, nor would we see all the stuff going on in our social media and culture war. So, Micki, when you guys are talking about that at the state level, thinking about how you navigate that, how do you think about helping them get out of those camps?
And, Drew, for me, I very much still identify as teacher. And so I think that most teachers want to do their best work and want to do everything that they can possibly do to support their students. And so what we've tried to do, really challenging the status quo is to look at the student outcomes and to think about making database decisions and really being empowered not only by the professional learning, but also by an aligned instructional resource that's going to support the teacher in actually delivering that level of instruction that would be aligned to the professional learning that they're receiving. And so, that part is really a local decision in Kentucky, but we're doing everything that we can to signal quality around the instructional resources and those practices and strategies that can be implemented in classrooms so that they can begin to see the impact on students. And we do have to be critical consumers. And so we have to consider if something is not working for even this individual student, what can we do as a practitioner to refine those our skills to support that student in learning as well?
Anybody want to add anything to that?
I guess I would just reiterate what Natalie said before, which is I think, one of the things that I see on my social media feeds and in my inbox are just lots of teachers embracing this, embracing the fact that there's stuff they didn't know that they want to know. And I think, so obviously there are camps and people with deep beliefs, but I think for a lot of teachers, in fact, at the end of the day, like they want to teach their kids how to read. They want to do the best by them. And so many teachers have had a gut level feeling for a long time that something wasn't quite right. They had a number, they know that there are kids every year that they're not reaching. And some in some schools and in some years, it's lots of kids. And I think that's one of the big things that I've learned from this reporting. I think a big aha for me is learning how to read is actually difficult for a lot of people. This is not an easy task. And I think that a lot of our instruction has sort of assumed that some kids will need a lot of help, but most kids will be able to get it and put most of it together with sort of broad instruction and lots of being read to at home. And that actually isn't really the case. And so I think there are a lot of teachers who sort of get that, but they really thought they were working really hard and doing what the experts told them to do. And it was resulting in 30, 40, 50, maybe 60. We think scores are really great when 65 or 70% of the kids are doing well. That's good test scores, and test scores are not the only measure here. But, we have to realize that we're a country that has come to think that if you have like 80% of the kids reading proficiently, you're doing really, really well. Well, whoa, wait a minute. Why did we decide that, where did we decide that 20 or 30% of the kids shouldn't? So anyway, I think a lot of teachers are embracing this because they've known there's a problem, and it's a relief to them to be like, oh, okay. There's some stuff I can learn, and there are some other ways to do this that will work better. And I think lots and lots of teachers, and I think Kate could probably talk about this, start teaching differently and notice right away that it's different.
Yeah, go ahead, Kate.
Everything Emily said, I agree with. And I think with teachers, the best entry point is when it's not threatening, right? So, if they're coming into it and we're saying to them, you didn't know, like you were not taught this in teachers college. You were not given the right materials. This is not your fault, but look at what we know from the research and what we should be moving towards. If it's a case of no blame, something interesting I find is a lot of the teachers who I think kind of came around to it first, or, kind of in the groups that I'm associated with, are the ones whose own children didn't learn to read easily. Because when it's other people's kids, we can kind of attribute it to different reasons, right? I'll be honest, sometimes it used to be the whole, well, they probably weren't read too much at home, or, the family situation or that sort of thing. But when it's your own kid and you're a teacher, darn well, you were always reading to them at home and they had those advantages. But wait a second, they're still struggling to read. There must be something more to it, right? So I think the more teachers have the information that they need to kind of move forward. And I don't think it's even just teachers. I think with our leadership as well, like I know I've done presentations for superintendents and directors, and I've said to them, nobody's blaming you. Because if we have a situation where they have their backup, or they feel like they need to sort of dig their heels in and they need to prove they were right, or they need to keep this program because they spent thousands of dollars on it, nobody's blaming them because they didn't know either, right? We just want everybody to move forward, so the kids can read as best they can. So it's not even just about the teachers. teachers. I think the whole idea of no blame, and I have never felt any blame. I mean, I've read and listened to everything that Natalie and Emily do. I don't think there's any teacher blaming going on there whatsoever. And I think that's a really good starting point for the teacher education piece.
Well, so thinking then about how we help teachers make that shift, if we sort of want to move to this more science of reading backed approach. Notice, Emily, I didn't say teaching the science of reading. Letters, right? So clarifying what letters is in case everybody, make sure everybody understands what that is. But how do we measure the impact of letters? Are there other ways to help teachers make this shift and do this instruction well? What does that look like in our classrooms at the earliest ages up through the middle and high school ages? And how will we know it's actually working, right? Like, what is an acceptable number? Because 50-60% is not okay. I think we can all agree on that. But there are other things at play here. There are some other factors and variables in how well kids learn how to read. So how do we measure impact of letters? What is letters? All of those kinds of questions that I just posed there.
And I don't mind to start by talking about the Kentucky context around that just a bit. So letters is a professional learning. Again, it's not a curriculum, the language essentials for teachers of reading and spelling. And that is the first professional learning that's being provided by the Kentucky Reading Academies. And the intent is again to help teachers to know how the brain works, how students learn to read, and why some students are struggling so that they can better tailor instruction and intervention to support the diverse needs of early readers and young readers. There's also professional learning for administrators connected to that as well, which hits on that earlier point that really we're looking for systemic change here, and that's going to need to be supported by school building administrators and district leaders as well. But for the KDE, we are seeking via an RFP, so request for proposal, a third-party evaluator to really help us to gauge the impact of the professional learning. So obviously within letters, we get information regarding the educator, time spent in the professional learning, pre and post unit test as well. But we really want to see more of a focus on the student outcomes of those teachers and educators who have participated, not for any sort of blaming, Kate, I think to your earlier point, but to help us to see where additional professional learning supports need to go beyond this first phase of letters that we're implementing across the state. So we hope to have that in place by March of 2023 so that we can partner along with a third party to really tailor what we want that evaluation to consist of. Because we feel the weight and responsibility of being good stewards of the ESSER ARP funding that we're utilizing, as well as the Read to Succeed fund that's associated with the policy lever in Kentucky.
Emily?
I think there's a sort of fundamental problem and tension in all of this, which is that in research, in education research, right? So the only way that you can sort of prove if something works is if you isolate that thing, right? You do that thing and the idea is to isolate it down to one program or something that you're doing, one lever that you're pushing, and then you're trying to see, is there change as a result of that, right? But one of the things we know with reading and all of education is it's complex, and change is not likely to happen by pressing one lever. So we can press one lever and we're probably only going to see little bits of change, even in the best cases, by pressing one lever. So you actually have to press multiple levers. You have to change the professional learning. You have to look at the curriculum. You have to look what the administrators know. You have to start changing teacher preparation. You have to look at what you're using for screening. You have to look at how you're measuring things. You have to look at the knowledge piece, the curriculum. You have to look at kids when they're older. There's so many parts of it. And the problem is that you can't design a study that looks at all of that. It's too messy. It's too complex. You cannot prove cause and effect that way. So it's a problem.
Yep.
I would love to second that. I think Emily has hit the nail on the head big time. And I think one problem, I'd say one thing that teachers will, I think, need, even after they've been through a training like letters, is a curriculum that that guides them for what to do in the classroom, and not just on the decoding side, but also on the knowledge building side. And there are now a number of elementary literacy curricula that do both of those things, that do a really good job. And I would refer people to the website of the Knowledge Matters campaign for more information about those curricula and just the role of knowledge and comprehension in general. But on the research point, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that's one of the problems, say, with the National Reading Panel report, which has come to sort of define, these 5 components, the 5 pillars of early literacy. And I think what they did on phonemic awareness, phonics, seems quite solid. I'm not that much of an expert there, but I trust what they did. But when a lot of people look at what they did on comprehension and think, okay, this is what the science of reading says about comprehension. What they don't know, and what I only recently sort of stumbled upon, was that the National Reading Panel didn't ask, how can we best teach kids to help kids understand what they read? They had a much narrower focus because they were looking at studies, experimental studies, and their question was, is there evidence that teaching comprehension strategies boosts kids' comprehension? Which is a very different question, right? So it's not that the National Reading Panel should be taken as defining what we need to do for comprehension. One more point about assessment. I think in this country, we've really screwed up reading assessment because most of the time we purport to be measuring reading comprehension using standardized measures. 2 problems with that. One is, if a kid scores poorly in 4th grade or 5th grade on a standardized reading test, it's usually assumed to be because they don't have the comprehension skills at the level they're supposed to. And so they get more practice with those things. Well, they may have decoding problems. They may have fluency problems. Secondly, it's very hard to use a standardized reading test to measure whether kids are actually acquiring academic knowledge and vocabulary, because the passages on those standardized reading tests are not tied to any body of knowledge. So they could have learned a lot about Greek myths, the human digestive system, all sorts of things, but the test passages are on the Inuit or Amelia Earhart and whatever. And they may not yet have the critical mass of academic knowledge and vocabulary that would enable them to understand any quote unquote grade level reading passage. So that is a very blunt instrument by which to measure whether kids are acquiring kind of knowledge they need to ultimately understand complex text.
There's a lot of fundamental catch-22s built into our system. And that's one of them, because we do not, as a country, we sort of fundamentally are against the idea that we're going to define a body of knowledge and make sure everyone knows it. And it's really sort of written into our system that we're not really going to do that. And it brings up lots of controversy for good reason. Deciding what knowledge everyone should know is very tricky. But if you don't do that, then you actually really can never appropriately measure reading comprehension, because you are not teaching kids something, and then seeing if they know it. You are just doing exactly what Natalie just said. So it is always going to be a problem.
Yeah. Well, one more question, I think, maybe, before I think we'll start to dive into some audience questions. We've got some good ones here. And Kate and Micki, I think maybe you can speak to this, and I'm sure Emily and Natalie can as well. But what does it look like in day to day, like that? Kate, in your classroom, you're, I think, kindergarten, right? So what does that reading instruction look like? And as we see them grow as readers, and how we differentiate, right? Because one of the criticisms is that kids are bored by science of reading kinds of approaches and phonics, and that they aren't getting that enjoyment of reading that is sort of promised, that magic of sitting in the nook and all of those kinds of things. And Micki, as a former high school, right, you want them to be engaging with those texts and loving reading. But that's really tricky. I was a voracious reader as a young kid. And then my mom always jokes. She said, I stopped reading and said, I've read all the books in the library that I think are good. And, so it's like, well, obviously that's not true, but it's tricky. Emily's, your point, it's like, it's a squishy problem with all these things going on, right? So what does it look like granularly at the, early elementary lesson level? And then how do we keep that enjoyment of reading and counter that? Because that is something that we certainly want to foster, right?
I can jump in on that first, just kind of starting at the kindergarten level. So, I mean, what a literacy looks like in my class, I break it up through the day. We have play-based kindergarten here in Ontario, so I certainly don't sit them for a 90-minute language block all at once. But I know a lot of people recommend 30 minutes a day of that sort of foundational piece of the phonological awareness and the phonics, which we do. And then you need to have that time for, as Natalie mentioned, they're going to get the comprehension from your rich read alouds, right? You are reading things to them that they can't yet decode. So that's where you're getting all of that, the knowledge building piece. And I've actually taken some of Natalie's advice and started trying to do more thematic kind of read aloud so that they're getting the same vocabulary and the ideas kind of repeated. So that knowledge is really consolidating. So you have that piece. There's time for them to practice. I mean, they have their decodable books. And so they practice reading them to me, and we do partner reading and all of that sort of thing. And then writing is another component we're not talking a lot about tonight, but certainly time for writing as well. And, starting with the idea that you're expecting them to, we're doing a handwriting instruction, but you're expecting them to be able to spell what they're learning to read. So the consonants we've learned, the short vowels we've learned, they can correctly spell those words. So we even do little spelling tests. And I know somebody on Twitter was not happy that I called it a test in kindergarten, but we are the ones telling them what tests are. And they're seeing that tests are something fun where you're showing what you know. And so that's great. And then other than that, they're kind of using estimated spelling. I also do some oral things. For example, I know from Natalie's book with Judith Hochman talking about the writing revolution and, the idea of what is a complete sentence. And if I just say the girl, is that a complete sentence? No. So what would be a complete sentence? So you're doing those things orally. So they're already starting to get the idea of composition before they can actually write all of those words out themselves. And then as you move up in primary, I mean, certainly that foundational piece, we want to see K to 2. In a perfect world, at the end of grade 2, they've learned it all. And so by the time they get to grade 3, you're doing a lot more of, like digging into the comprehension piece and then the fluency and the vocabulary and all of those other, kind of rich parts. It really is incorrect when people say that a structured literacy approach causes kids to not enjoy reading. Because, I mean, not only is there research, I mean, there's one study I wrote down, just so I'm not one of those people that says research shows, but Van Bergen and colleagues did one. And the title of it is Literacy Skills Seem to Fuel Literacy Enjoyment Rather Than Vice Versa. And there are other studies that show the same, that teaching kids to read makes them love reading, makes them like reading, makes them do more. And then there's that whole cycle and you're just trying to avoid that Matthew effect, right? So, the whole enjoyment piece, like my kids love a boring little book, like The Dog Is in the Mud, because they are reading it themselves. They're so proud of themselves and what they're doing. So I don't think there's any danger of having kids not enjoy reading because of this approach. And then, as I mentioned, the higher you get up in the grades, the ratio of the different pieces is going to look different. And then Micki can kind of take it from there with the older students.
Well, if it's okay, first, I would like to say in my role, I do have the privilege of being able to visit different districts and schools and classrooms across the state. And so for me, when I am seeing students engage in that explicit cumulative phonics component of the course, I have seen them, in fact, be very engaged in that experience rather than stifled and just with expressions of blank boredom. So I have not personally seen that. And my thought is that I wonder if that's more of a fear of the perception. So for the educator who is in the position of being a reader, if it's perceived to be boring versus the student experience who is learning this from the first time and acquiring that decoding ability, I have seen the opposite of that. And there is a sense of excitement around one's ability to decode it and to be able to read. But, another thing that we are really thinking about is how we can scale this beyond and what that should look like for students outside of elementary school, so grade 4 and beyond, really. And we're recommending that there is a place for advanced phonemic awareness and phonics and looking at morphology and syntax and all of those things that can not only help students become better readers, but that translates to their writing as well. And so there is much space for the advancement of that in a grade level appropriate way throughout the K through 12 progression.
Natalie?
Well, I'd like to follow up on both what Kate and Micki alluded to about writing, because I think, I know this is all, we've already got a lot of balls in the air here, but literacy is complicated and writing often gets overlooked. And writing is not just an important skill in itself, but Micki also mentioned syntax. So I think what is often overlooked as a barrier to comprehending complex text is students' lack of familiarity with complex syntax, with sentence structures that are not found in conversation, that we don't use in conversation, like, you know, a passive voice or a subordinating conjunction, but are often used in written text. And a tremendously powerful way to help to familiarize, I'd say one way to familiarize students with that complex syntax of written language is to read aloud to them. But even more powerful is to teach them explicitly how to use that kind of complex syntax in their own writing. And not only does that equip them to write at a higher level, it equips them to read at a higher level because they're much more likely to understand a sentence with, you know, a subordinating conjunction if they know how to write a sentence with a subordinating conjunction. So I'm just going to use this 10 more seconds here to say I would lobby for moving away from science of reading to a term like science of literacy, because literacy draws on, it's not just reading and it's not even just writing, it's listening, speaking, reading and writing. They all can work they all need to be joined together for students to become truly literate.
Okay, well, let's shift to some of these questions that have been submitted and upvoted on Slido or Slido, however that is pronounced. And also, if you all have some questions for one another, feel free to ask those as well. But the one that's been upvoted the most: what about struggling older readers in the classroom? How do we shift practice to knowledge and vocab building and focus on phonics and decoding skills gaps? And I'll add a little piece there, because one of the things I hear from my teacher friends who are maybe not or haven't been trained in the sort of structured literacy thing is they say, well, we do use phonics. And of course, in my podcast with Mandy McLaren, we talked about that a bit, but anybody want to add on to that? Like, what is the difference between using phonics in an effective way and one that's not? But also, I'll read the question again, and anybody feel free to jump in and take this. What about struggling older readers in the classroom? How do we shift practice to knowledge and vocab building and focus on phonics and decoding skills gaps?
Well, I'll jump in and then others can follow. But I get asked this question a fair amount, but not so much about the phonics side. But I always say, you know, if you've got a struggling reader, the first thing to determine is, can that reader decode fluently or reasonably fluently, no matter what grade level they're in? There's an enormous problem that we're not really aware of because we don't collect data on it, of kids at upper grade levels, high school, who really never learned to decode. And I think we need to start testing for that at the high school level. But simultaneously, you know, we can't just work on their phonics and their phonemic awareness, whatever they need. We do need to be building their knowledge and their academic vocabulary. And there's not a lot that works at the high school level. I think intensive tutoring can work, but, you know, kids are often coming in with gaps, very large gaps in background knowledge that really prevent them from accessing what they're expected to do for 10th grade, 11th grade, or whatever. And I would put in another plug for writing instruction, explicit, carefully sequenced writing instruction, a method like the Writing Revolutions, can really help, you know, even at higher grade levels, because it can, first of all, help to identify. I mean, you can't make up for all the gaps that in students' knowledge when they're in high school, but what are the things that they don't know that are preventing them from understanding what they're supposed to be learning? Writing can be a terrific way of identifying those gaps, and it also can be a terrific way of filling those gaps, because when you write, and there are studies to this effect, when you write about what you're learning, it really boosts your understanding and your retention of that information.
Yeah. Emily, anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I guess I'll just reiterate what Natalie said. I mean, I do think that there are a decent number. I get this question all the time in my email, and I don't have a good response to this question because I think it's very difficult. Once kids get older, it becomes like a practical problem. What part of the day are you going to use to go back and teach them the structure of written language that they maybe were never actually taught? And they've picked up parts of it and they're okay with it. And I guess one of the things that I think I agree with Natalie that there needs to be more and better sophisticated screening being done of older kids who are struggling reading to try to figure out what is really going on. And there are a lot of teachers who are like, well, they can decode. And sure, but if a kid is in middle school and is still decoding the words, you've got a problem because they're still using their brain just to figure out the words. And they're not automatic with those words, and they're not getting what you ultimately want someone to get from reading, which is being able to fluently read the text and understand it as you're going and pause when you need to and go back and figure out, and all the things that you need to be able to do as a sophisticated reader require you to be very adept and automatic with most of the words that you see. And if these kids are not adept and automatic, even if they sort of can do it through laboriously figuring them out, you've got a kid who has not had enough practice and has not had enough teaching to really have made that stuff automatic, and may have other things going on, reading disabilities with working memory and processing speed and all of that needs special attention.
Right, getting into the cognitive load theory kind of stuff. Kate, what about that issue of like, were you using phonics before, but then shifted how you used phonics?
The funny thing is, in our board, someone sent me a historical document the other day showing right after the National Reading Panel, the literacy plan that came out, and they actually purchased Jolly Phonics for all the K and 1 classrooms, which was fantastic that they did that. And Jolly Phonics is known to be a fairly effective program. So that was great. We weren't using it as well as we could have because we were very much doing the letter of the week kind of idea. Research tells us now we can go faster. The biggest problem was the books we were giving the kids to read. And that's where, I saw my experiences reflected in Emily's work, because I can remember asking a mom, is your daughter done with her little reader she's been practicing at home? And the mom said, well, I'm not going to send it back till she can read all the words with the pictures covered. And I thought, well, that's mean. She's never going to be able to read all the words with the pictures covered. How's she supposed to know which zoo animal it is, or whatever the case was, right? And that's where I started to sort of realize, okay, this isn't right. So there was some phonics, but it wasn't explicit and systematic phonics, and we weren't using the right tools. If you don't mind, I want to mention in terms of the older students too, how you were just asking. I've been collaborating a lot with a grade 7-8 teacher at my school. I teach at a K-8 school, and kind of what structured literacy should look like there. And, it kind of goes back to one thing Emily mentioned, the assessment piece. You really need to have good assessments if you want to figure out what gaps the kids have and what you need to be working on with them. So we kind of set aside the assessment things that Sold a Story has told us are not the ones we want to be using. We did a Dibble screener with the 7-8s. It was free, it was fast, and we could start to determine who was below benchmark or well below benchmark, for the different pieces. When we saw that accuracy actually was good, then we knew that going back to the phonics piece probably wasn't a big deal. However, the automaticity piece of the words correct per minute left a lot to be desired. So then we knew that it was a fluency intervention for a lot of them that we wanted to keep doing. And then did an intervention, tested again, kind of saw where the kids were. But then you see those few kids that still need something. And that's where you really have to do creative small group stuff. I mean, high school is different. The way we are here, K-8, the homeroom teacher covers almost all of the subjects. So they can kind of work their day around picking that group when they need to take that group. And so I know that's harder in high school with the way that rotary works, but you have to have assessment data, and it has to be valid and reliable assessment data, not the sort of running record things that we're used to using, in order to know anything about where kids' gaps are and try to meet those.
Okay, well, let's go to the second most upvoted question. Can you speak to how structured literacy is beneficial for ELLs? I hear all the time that newcomers, quote, don't know enough English, unquote, to benefit from it. Anybody have something to say to that, can speak to that, that's sort of beneficial for ELLs?
Well, I can start. I think that everything that's beneficial for kids whose native language is English is going to also be beneficial for ELLs. I mean, I think the read alouds and discussion, when I've talked to teachers who have switched from this sort of leveled reading, focus on comprehension skills approach to one where they're reading a content-rich text to the whole class, and the whole class is engaged in discussion of that content, what I've heard is that it's often the kids who are still learning English, or the kids who have IEPs, who make the most insightful contributions to class discussion and feel like members of the classroom community rather than being relegated to the low reading group. So I think that's beneficial. Also, I would say explicit writing instruction again is hugely beneficial. Now, it's going to make a difference what age these students are. Obviously, it's going to be easier for kids to pick up a language the younger they are. So if you've got an 11th or 12th grader who knows no English, I think, you're really going to have to use different techniques than you would with a kindergartner or a first grader.
Okay.
Can I say one thing about that? I mean, I think this is where just helping everyone understand the sort of basics of what it takes to become a reader, and that there's a difference between learning a spoken language and learning a written language, right? So this idea that this stuff doesn't work for English language learners doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. It's very clear that English language learners need something that native speakers don't, which is they need to learn how to speak the language. So they need to learn how to speak the language. They also need to learn how to read the language. And many of the things that you're doing to help them read the language is probably going to accelerate and help with the spoken language, but they're going to very much benefit from a lot of, from like the reading aloud, all of the ways that oral language is integrated to the classroom. Again, very important to think about what age they are. But I think this idea that this is some sort of controversial or different for English language learners, like we all need to learn similar things to become good readers. And the problem, the challenge before you with an English language learner is that they need to learn how to speak English too. And you don't need to do that with a kindergartner who grew up speaking English.
Okay, well, let's go to the next question. Micki, this might be one that you have a handle on better than the others, but perhaps not. So what percentage of ELA instruction time do you think should be divided between word recognition, language comprehension, and writing skills in different grades? I'm imagining that there's no hard and fast number to that, but that's the question.
And I will say that there will be variances depending upon the selected core resource that's utilized by the teacher within the particular building. But generally speaking, we advise, again, about 20 to 30 minutes should be utilized for phonemic awareness, phonics instruction, and then the remaining time should be those other components that Kate really has already mentioned to allow students to engage with grade level texts. That's one thing that I've not yet been able to say, but I think part of the issue is that in an attempt to support students, we sometimes prevent them from being exposed to grade level learning and to grade level text. And that's where they're going to get some of that vocabulary and the knowledge from the text as well. And that happens for middle school and high school students. So if they're not given the ability to engage with grade level text, then they're never going to eliminate the gaps within their knowledge and learning as they move forward. And so I think each of those components that Kate described are critical for students to experience. And I know there is some variance with K2 and 3 through 5, but we would argue that those are important components throughout the full K through 5 band. Okay.
Well, thank you for that. So one was upvoted here to, we talked about this a little bit, but what is the biggest obstacle for schools to embrace evidence-based reading instruction? Anybody want to speak to that? The biggest obstacle? And I'll say this. One of the things that I have the opportunity to do is to talk to all kinds of educators and people who work in this space, literacy and education in general. And it's been really kind of bizarre, but really interesting. And I'm sure some of you have heard this kind of thing, is to have people I very much respect say things that are really, really strong statements. And Emily, I'm going to say this, and I'm sure you've probably heard something like this before, but people saying, Emily Hanford has done more to hurt kids than anybody else. And I'm like, wow, that's a really bizarre, strong, active statement, right? So we're talking about embracing evidence-based reading instruction, coming over that hurdle. Is there anything bigger? Nobody wants to take the bait.
I mean, Emily, if you want to respond first, go right ahead.
No.
I mean, I think change is always hard. And as we were talking about earlier, I think people often perceive this as an attack on them because it's criticizing what they've been doing, but it is not intended to be that. I will say, I mean, I think there are lots of obstacles to getting, to changing our reading instruction. I am seeing, and I think others are seeing, that there is real movement towards at least trying to teach phonics systematically, foundational skills systematically. And I think there's also movement towards building knowledge rather than focusing on these sort of comprehension skills and strategies in the abstract. But I'd say currently, I think what's happening in a lot of places is people see this as, we just need to add more phonics, just adopt a phonics patch, and we can continue everything else that we're doing. And that way, I think, lies disaster, because, if you combine systematic phonics with predictable rather than decodable text, for example, that can be a problem. Also, if you combine a phonics patch with a failure to build academic knowledge and vocabulary and teach writing explicitly, what you're going to find is in a few years, when kids get to upper grade levels, teachers will start saying, well, they can decode, but they cannot understand what they're supposed to read. And I fear, as has happened before, that phonics, people who are skeptical of phonics will then say, well, you see, phonics doesn't work. And we'll be back in a situation where people are not teaching phonics systematically, nor are they building knowledge. And that would be the worst of all possible worlds.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that I tried to make clear in the Soul to Story podcast, is that it is not about, this is not a matter of adding, it's not just a matter of adding something. It's about taking away stuff that isn't working, that isn't a good use of time, as Kate talked about, and that may actually be harming children, right? So schools, I think, tend to just add on. And I've gone in and gotten records from schools and looked at all the stuff that they've bought, and boy, did they buy a lot of stuff. And there's, so you can say, well, they do have this and they have that and they have this. And then none of that's working. And you think, well, what's actually being used in the classroom? How much can actually be used? What needs to be taken away so that you focus on the things that matter the most?
So, yeah, go ahead, Kate.
I think in terms of the whole, obstacle, something I see with individual educators is kind of those entrenched beliefs and the difference between their personal anecdotal evidence and actual research evidence. Because, some very experienced teachers are looking at things saying, well, but I've been doing this for years and the kids are learning to read just fine, because that's how they see what's been happening in their classrooms, right? Because you're always going to have those few special education kids who aren't going to, and I'm not saying you always will, but that's kind of a belief of some people, right? That, those ones are never going to read. And I think some don't realize, I'll move away from foundational skills to make Natalie happy here, but even in terms of the comprehension stuff, some people might say, well, I've taught a strategy of the month every year and the kids learn just fine, but they have no idea that if they had done it another way, the kids may have learned even better, right? And, those whole levels of readers and thinking that kids have improved because they've gone up in levels, and teachers not understanding that the levels don't mean anything because they're just not there in their journey yet. So I think for a lot of them, it's just them thinking there's been nothing wrong with what I've been doing. And so it's kind of a harder sell to prove to them why they should have to change if they think that their kids have been learning to read and write fine.
Yeah. I actually have an anecdote relating to that. When I was, I think both on the comprehension side and on the decoding side, it can look like what teachers are doing is working, even if it's not. And it's not apparent until higher grade levels that it's not. So for example, I was at a school when I was doing the research for my book, where I met with some fifth grade teachers, and they said they always knew that this was at a school serving a high poverty Spanish speaking population. They always knew that their fifth grade students struggled with reading, and they always assumed it was a comprehension problem. But for the first time, they gave them a test that required them to just decode words, and they were shocked to find that these kids couldn't decode simple words like pipe. And they said to me, well, now we have a new principal. And it used to be that they were just doing whole language, balanced literacy stuff in kindergarten, first grade. And now we have a new principal, and that's not happening anymore. But I had talked to a kindergarten teacher at that school, and she told me, oh, I just do a mishmash of things. And fortunately, the principal lets me do what I feel is right, and it's working beautifully. And I predict that those kids, when they get to fifth grade, they may also not be able to decode the word pipe. So it's a tough problem.
It's a tough problem. And, the other thing is that there's a lot of parents who are taking care of this problem outside of school. And we have to really recognize that. And it's very hard to get a handle on how big that is. But that is what I've been seeing in my reporting for years, is that if you have a kid who's in first and second grade and they're not struggling, and you have the means and ability in terms of time or money to take care of that problem on your own, you do. And that means that the parents who don't have the means, or maybe don't know, because many parents don't know that their kids are struggling because the school is telling them they're fine because they're on grade level when it comes to their DRA or their F&P or whatever level. And I concur that what I hear over and over again is that it starts to reveal itself in third, fourth, and fifth grade when all of these skills are building and accumulating, right? And if there's pieces of it that are missing, it all starts to fall apart. And for many kids, the fact that they haven't been learned how to read the words is really starts to fall. The words get longer and harder, and the pictures go away, and they don't know how to read them, and they really start falling behind on the accumulation of all of the other skills and knowledge that they need to eventually be a really good reader by high school and college. And what Natalie said earlier is really important. Like, even for kids who are doing well, their sort of listening and language comprehension skills exceed their reading ability up until they're 10, 11, 12 years old. But these things are all happening at the same time. At the same time, kids who are good readers are starting to accumulate knowledge and skills through reading when they're 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. So you really have this exponential situation happening where these gaps are just growing and getting wider. And that's why I said at the very beginning that we need to understand that it's times, not plus, because that's how this becomes so exponentially huge. It's times, not plus.
Well, I'm mindful of time, and I know, Micki, you have something you wanted to add there, and then I have one more question from Slido, whatever that is, and then if we have any questions among us. But Micki, go ahead and add what you wanted to say there.
I'll be very quick, and because this is not something that's going to be surprising to anyone, but from the perspective of a state level leader, funding is also an issue. So we're hearing from district leaders, from building administrators who have wanted to participate in professional learning capacities and different opportunities that have not had access to funding. And in our state, there has not been state level funding for professional learning or for the selection of instructional resources for over a generation of students. And so now we also have a communication problem where we're trying to say the Kentucky Reading Academies it's free. We just need you to be interested. We need you to be willing to participate with us because it is so unusual for us to have the opportunity to be able to provide something like that to educators across the state.
Okay, so my last question, then I'm going to pull, I'm going to try to combine a couple of them. So one, which is about the role of state agencies, and then any role at the national level, and what that should be, what those roles might be, and why or why not. And I think it maybe pairs nicely with the question about teacher preparation, which of course is our universities. And how do we shift and get our teacher preparation programs to more effectively teaching, reading instruction? So, whoever wants to speak to that, maybe Micki, maybe you can speak to some of the state level roles and that kind of thing.
Sure. Well, again, I feel like one of our primary responsibilities of the moment is implementing Senate Bill 9, the Read to Succeed Act, with fidelity and making sure that educators across our state have the information that's needed around what is required around that law. In addition to the resources that are being provided by the KDE, but we are seeking partners, university partners, not only to participate in the Kentucky Reading Academies, but also to begin thinking about what methods course instruction could look like for pre-service teachers who will be entering classrooms that may or may not have access to a high quality instructional resource. And so I am encouraged and I'm very excited to move forward with our partners from post-secondary to be able to begin thinking about how there can be more coherence between the pre-service teacher experience with what will be asked of a teacher in a classroom across the state.
Emily, I know in your podcast you had pieces about George Bush and all of that at the national level. Do you see any significant role, or have you seen any movement from at the national level to sort of shift that conversation?
well, have you watched what's happening in our national politics? I just don't think, I mean, what has been said to me is like the kind of bipartisan buy-in that we had actually at the beginning of Reading First. We're just so far away from that. The idea that Congress would pass some sort of massive something I actually don't think that's going to happen. And maybe that's not the best way. I mean, I think there's this whole thing is a tricky balance and dance between top down and bottom up, right? I think top down often has unintended consequences. Kate, or I don't know who mentioned, you mentioned at the beginning that you're not requiring this in Kentucky. And Micki said, and so, you know, I do think people react when they're required to do something. And so, but if you don't require people to do something, some people will never do it. And, you know, I think, you know, I think in many, I think it's very tricky. And I think anyone and everyone who's involved in any part of this needs to always think about the balance between top down and bottom up. It just needs to always be like being readjusted. That's all I guess I'll say.
Well, as we wrap up here, and I know some of you may have questions for one another. I know Micki and I were talking the other day, and I think you had a question about curriculum or materials, right? And maybe that question has been answered here. If you have any questions for one another or sort of last parting thoughts, Micki, I'll give you the opportunity to ask that question if it's still pertinent.
I think one thing that we are continuing to think about now that teachers are going through the letters training specifically, it is what would be the next step for the Kentucky Reading Academies. What would be that next level of support? So they now have the pedagogy, they understand how students learn to read, why some students are struggling, but what would you recommend? And Kate, maybe you specifically could help us to think about this more directly for that next phase of professional learning. We're trying so desperately to make an investment in people and to encourage others to want to participate. And we're getting their feedback as well. But just if you had any recommendations on your experience, what equipped you to kind of make this shift and mindset change?
I think what hopefully you'll see is the ones who have been trained, because as I understand, Letters isn't the program, right? Letters is the professional development for the teachers. When they're getting into their classrooms, they're using it, they're seeing success. Hopefully that teacher next door is going, well, wait a second, what are you doing there? And so the word kind of starts to spread. So that can certainly help. For the ones who have the training, I think the next thing is, you know, having good resources, those materials for them to use as well, because if they've got all that background information and all that information on how to best teach literacy, they'll need some of those tools too. And that's what I would recommend. I was kind of making things up on my own for a little while until I finally got an actual program resource this year, which made things a whole lot easier.
We do have a consumer guide.
I'm sorry?
Oh, we do have a consumer guide for the selection and evaluation of instructional resources connected to reading and writing. And so hopefully, to your point, as more teachers are talking to other teachers, as building administrators are talking to other principals, some of that will work itself out. But we're trying to find ways to have implementation networks so that there's communities of practice so that they feel supported as they are undergoing some of these really monumental shifts with instruction within our state.
Natalie?
Well, it sounds like I was going to suggest that you look at what some other states have been doing, like Tennessee. It sounds like you have Tennessee, Louisiana, Texas. And I think this curriculum piece, I think, is really important. I think it's important for teachers to understand the why, but they also need the how once they've got the why. And so Tennessee, for example, has a list of approved curricula that districts can choose from. And I think what would make a lot of sense, and maybe Tennessee is doing that, to have grants available. I know Texas is doing this. Grants available for professional development grounded in the specifics of whatever curriculum, whatever high quality curriculum a district chooses to adopt. I think that's where you're really going to see some results. When teachers have the why, they have a guide to how to do it, and they have support in that how, because it's going to be a big change, a big shift for a lot of teachers. So that's what I would say.
Thank you.
Okay, well, like I said, I'm mindful of time. We've gone past what I'd expected to get to 6:30. There's just so many questions. I apologize to all of the questions that are on here. Certainly not going to get to all of them. I want to give a big thank you to all four of you for joining us and everybody who has joined us. This will be as a podcast recording out probably later this week. Anybody who got an email from me, as a reminder, feel free to reply to me. And reach out, and our website is wegrowteachers.com. I want to give you all an opportunity to say any last words, or again, if you have any questions, feel free as well. So Kate, you have anything? Micki, you had your question, right? So we'll go to Kate.
No, I just want to thank everybody who took time out to listen tonight. I mean, I remember I did a webinar in the summer and so many educators giving of their own time. And I know it depends where you are right now, but we're on holiday break here. And I know there are lots of people who, have joined us tonight giving their own time to further their professional development when it comes to literacy. So thank you, everybody. And it's been such an honor to be part of the panel. Thank you, Drew.
Natalie?
Yeah, no, I would just second that. I don't want to trespass on people's time too much longer. So I would just say, yes, thanks for listening. Thanks for thinking about all of this. And thank you, Drew, for organizing it.
Yeah. Emily?
Well, I'll third that, and thank you very much. And I won't take any more time, but I do know that lots of teachers have to do this on their own time, and that's unfortunate. They shouldn't have to.